Welcome to War of the Words podcast. I'm your host, Wayne Besen. On today's show, we discuss how the American economy performs significantly better under Democratic presidents than Republican presidents. We take you to a Hawaiian island owned by a Republican megadonor to see how extreme right-wing policies have negatively impacted the lives of locals. Then we interview star Chicago labor organizer Bill LePinske. We discuss what unions are doing as we head into the midterm elections. Thank you for joining us. Enjoy the show. One of the greatest political con jobs in contemporary history is Republicans convincing Americans that their party is better at handling the economy. Through pure chutzpah, the GOP has presented itself as the big daddy party of sensible spending, while Democrats are maddeningly shy about promoting their superior record. But let's make no mistake, one party is reckless and the other is responsible. And it's the opposite of what most Americans think. A New York Times analysis succinctly drives home that Democrats are far better at producing healthy economic outcomes. According to the analysis, quote, since 1933, the economy has grown at an annual average rate of 4.6% under Democratic presidents and 2.4% under Republicans. In more concrete terms, the average income of Americans would be more than double its current level if the economy had somehow grown at the Democratic rate for all of the past 9 decades. If anything, that period is too kind to Republicans because it excludes the portion of the Great Depression that happened on Herbert Hoover's watch. The 6 presidents who have presided over the fastest job growth have all been Democrats. The 4 presidents who have presided over the slowest growth have all been Republicans. Those are the cold, hard facts. I know Republicans these days aren't a big fan of facts, but the numbers don't lie. Additionally, over the last 4 decades, Republican presidents have run up larger deficits than Democrats. Much of this has to do with their cult-like embrace of supply-side economics, which George H.W. Bush once famously described as voodoo economics. The concept, also known as trickle-down, embraces the unsupported idea that tax cuts for billionaires spurs economic activity, thus increases tax receipts. Yes, it does lead to increased spending on yachts and private planes, but very few voters or small businesses are benefited by this fiscally failed fantasy pushed by Republicans. The Times analysis points out, quote, the evidence now overwhelmingly suggests that recent tax cuts have only a modest effect on the economy. GDP grew at virtually the same rate after the 2017 Trump tax cut as before it. If anything, the Clinton tax increase of 1993 has a better claim on starting a boom than any tax cut since. The Republican Party is also behind the hollowing out of the middle class. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, American workers thrived as corporations were forced to make concessions to treat employees with dignity and respect. Political scientist David Vogel described the balance of power during that time. He said, quote, from 1969 to 1972, virtually the entire American business community experienced a series of political setbacks without parallel in the post-war period. To reverse this trend, in 1971, future Supreme Court Justice Lewis Powell created a shrewd plan. He penned what is now known as the Powell Memo, a blueprint on how corporate America could leverage its wealth to legally bribe Washington politicians into doing their bidding at the expense of the poor and the middle class. Bill Moyers explained how corporate America began gravitating towards Washington to exert its influence. Quote, in 1971, only 175 firms had registered lobbyists in Washington, but by 1982, nearly 2,500 did. The number of corporate PACs increased from under 300 in 1976 to over 1,200 by the middle of 1980. On the very dimension of corporate political activity, the numbers reveal a dramatic, rapid mobilization of business resources in the mid-1970s. Ronald Reagan's demonization and demoralization of the labor movement sped up America's economic decline. Most notably, the Gipper fired 11,359 air traffic controllers who were on strike seeking higher wages and shorter hours. The end result of Republican economic malpractice is a nation where 58% of Americans live paycheck to paycheck. And those are the lucky ones. The rest survive by running up credit card debt, with balances reaching $841 billion in the first 3 months of 2022. And you all know what I'm talking about. Almost everyone we know has credit card debt these days, thanks to the Republican economy that has created nothing but chaos, misery, and pain. Republicans are quick to blame President Joe Biden for inflation and high gas prices. However, he's cleaning up the mess caused by Trump's tax cuts. He was also handicapped, at least initially, by supply chain difficulties, which were greatly exacerbated by Trump's abysmal handling of COVID-19. I mean, just imagine a scenario where Republicans and Donald Trump were responsible and didn't create mask wars and didn't create division during the pandemic. How much better off would we be economically today? Furthermore, there isn't much Joe Biden can do to control fuel prices, considering they are set by world markets. Inflation is also a global phenomenon, so to blame Democrats is ludicrous. Think about this. If Joe Biden is the primary cause of inflation, as Republicans cynically claim, then why is Turkey experiencing a 78% rise in inflation, Argentina 60%, the European Union 8.6%, and the United Kingdom 9.1%, all equal or greater than the United States at 8.6%? Think about it. Obviously, something more is going on than Biden and the Democrats' policies. But asking Republicans to think rationally or engage in critical thinking on the economy is a bridge too far, I suppose. The GOP's trifling macroeconomic performance has historically been tempered, at least at the national level, by Democrats. They have fought for labor, tried to roll back reckless GOP tax cuts, and raise the minimum wage. The Democrats, working with labor unions, have historically improved safety, helped end child labor, instituted the 40-hour work week, and created our beloved weekends. One wonders what conditions would be like if the Republican Party had no constraints and could assert full control over the lives of working people. Fortunately, we no longer have to speculate. There is a real-world example of a Republican-owned island where their cruel and draconian policies have been put into action. Lanai is a former pineapple plantation and one of the Hawaiian Islands. I myself went snorkeling there as a kid when I lived in Honolulu. In 2012, it was bought by Larry Ellison, the founder of Oracle Corp., the 11th wealthiest person in the world and a Republican megadonor. With his $300 million purchase of the island, Ellison controls roughly 90% of Lanai today. Instead of using his money and clout to improve the lives of Lanai's 3,000 residents, he behaved like a quintessential Cadillac conservative, catering to the ultra-wealthy at the expense of everyone else. One of his first actions, he brought in Nobu, a posh restaurant that few residents could afford to dine at. According to a must-read article by Bloomberg titled "The Lord of Lanai," Ellison's takeover of the island has given him extraordinary power over the island's citizens. The article says, quote, "So it goes on Lanai, where Ellison is a modern American king, incomprehensibly wealthy and powerful. Many residents both rent from him and work for him, and a provision in his residential leases states that if you're terminated from a job with any of his companies, you can be kicked out of your home too. Under Ellison, 30-day leases have become the norm for Lanai's small businesses, as opposed to the 5-year terms some were used to before he arrived." This is Exhibit A of Republican economics. They don't want to pay workers what they are worth. They don't want to provide benefits or share power. No. Instead, they create a toxic top-down ecosystem that keeps workers habitually insecure and perpetually dependent. If conservatives can force their employees to live hand-to-mouth, they'll hesitate to open their mouths to ask for higher salaries or safer working conditions. With the power to make one homeless or lose their business within 30 days, Ellison is essentially a nobleman, lording over a peasant class, toiling in his fields. They have virtually no options, few rights, and their lives could collapse in an instant if they so much as look sideways at a manager. Ellison, it seems, is creating an authoritarian Republican paradise, where the rich rule unobstructed and the people beg hat in hand for his benevolence. According to the Bloomberg article, quote, "Most of the more than 30 Lanai residents interviewed for this story say that because there are no real alternatives to Ellison's control, his decisions carry the force of law, with a minimum of discussion and hardly any due process. Lanai's small businesses are sputtering, and even by U.S. standards, the island's housing shortage is extreme. There's only one home for sale as of early June, a beachfront estate for $7.9 million. The median household income is only $59,000, but it appears to be climbing as richer residents move in. Locals whose families have lived on the island for generations, often sharing homes with parents and grandparents, are leaving as Ellison's construction workers and Four Seasons Hotel employees fill practically every available bed. This seems like gentrification on steroids to me, with Lanai becoming the world's largest gated community. To the extent normal people with families have a place on the island, it's to serve as maids for millionaires and butlers for billionaires. Given Ellison's vulture-like behavior, it's no surprise that he's fond of repeating a quote from Genghis Khan. "It's not sufficient that I succeed. All others must fail." Another Republican hobby, indifference to the environment, is evident on Lord Ellison's Island. A man who goes by Solomon represents the island's humpback whale marine sanctuary. Bloomberg reports that Ellison has refused to speak to Solomon about conservation. He said, quote, "I've been waiting now for 10 years to have a conversation." Additionally, Solomon claims that Ellison has done squat to deal with the mushrooming deer population that is damaging the local ecology, and that coral reefs are being harmed as mud from the island slides into the Pacific Ocean. Ellison, of course, is nowhere to be found. He's too busy riding around the island in his fancy automobiles. Republicans also have a strong preference for private schools that favor the wealthy. On cue, Ellison has talked of creating schools with a $895 a month tuition. Wow. Obviously, the children of servants laboring at his Lanai Four Seasons hotels won't be able to afford such exorbitant prices. Bloomberg reported that Ellison's representatives met with concerned parents after they were pressured to meet, but things got more heated when the attendees began asking, quote, whose kids exactly the new schools would be for. Well, obviously not them. If Republican leaders had their way, we'd all be serfs on their feudal farm, albeit they have already done enormous damage to the economy, with the top 1% of U.S. earners now holding more wealth than the middle class. It's understandable that people are upset about gas prices and inflation. I am. We're all frustrated. However, voting Republican is the opposite of what is needed for the economy to fully recover. It will not rebound by electing Republicans. Historically, Republicans have been worse for the economy, and today's GOP is a disaster. It has no plan for helping working families and would love nothing more than to fully transform all of America into the island of Lanai. We're here with Bill LePinske, who is fighting for unionization across the country. It's great to see you.
Hey, it's good to see you. It's been a while.
Yeah, it's been a while. Let's begin by your sales pitch. Why should somebody join a union?
Workers' organizations are there to protect workers' rights, right? And that's what a union is at its core. It's a band of workers coming together for the common good of their coworkers, for the working class in the United States. So their employers are almost certainly parts of large associations that are there to protect their interests, and workers in this country need to band together to protect their own rights.
And a lot of people are afraid, though. There's a lot of anti-union propaganda. What are some of the lies workers are hearing to keep them from getting benefits, for example, for improving their lives at their workplaces?
So I think what we see most of the time during an organizing drive is employers using unions are an outside third party. They're no charity. They're not here to look out for your own good. So a lot of times they'll use that tactic, saying that unions are just outside third parties, or that unions are just there to collect dues. And typically we'll cry, oh, you need to give us another chance. We're the ones that are here to look out for your rights, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, Walmart has gone so far to use surveillance technology and propaganda videos. They keep employees from talking to each other. What other types of efforts have you seen to keep people from unionizing?
Probably the most heavy-handed tactics they use are captive audience meetings, which is actually something that the current administration is scrutinizing really heavily right now. These are forced meetings where the employer will require the attendance of the employees to come to these meetings. A lot of times they'll hire professional outside labor persuaders or union busters to come in and use some heavy-handed tactics to instill fear and division amongst the workers.
How do workers fight back against that? I mean, it seems pretty scary when the people responsible for paying your bills, your rent, putting food on the table are taking such a major effort to stop you from unionizing.
Yeah, I mean, the best thing that they can do is be prepared for what's going to happen. and just be aware what the employer's tactics are going to be going into an organizing drive, right?
Mm-hmm.
A lot of that comes from education and just talking to the workers about what their rights are and making sure that they're aware of how to respond when the employer uses these heavy-handed tactics on them.
Unionization has been on the rise, and just this year, petitions for union membership increased 57% from last year, according to the National Labor Relations Board. And this is interesting too. Public approval for labor unions hit 68%, the highest level since 1965. What explains the sudden love for unions and support for joining?
I think that there's a lot of things that contributed to that. I think part of it is you're starting to see a younger workforce become more active.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of the baby boomer generation, you're starting to see retire and get out of the workforce. And this younger group of millennial workers tends to be very militant. I think that the pandemic played a lot into that. Employers during the pandemic weren't necessarily always looking out for their workers. On one hand, they were calling them heroes, heroes work here. But on the other, the reality was that these employers were not being taken care of at work. I think that probably contributed a lot to it. And just generally what's going on in the economy, I think, is affected a lot.
I think a lot of people, they took a break, they got to work from home too, and they didn't have to suffer the abuse every day from some of these bosses. They saw that life could be better and they aspired to more. They didn't have to settle for the same old that they had been inured to. They were used to it. I think they're seeing things from a new, fresh perspective by being away sometimes. Do you think that played into it?
Absolutely. Now that people are flooding back into the workplaces, they're no longer in a position where they want to tolerate it anymore, right? I think that probably played a lot into it. I think that the low unemployment numbers that we're seeing right now and the great resignation, right? There's a lot of work out there to be had, so people tend to be a little bit less afraid to organize right now.
Well, we've seen some successes. In April, Amazon warehouse workers in Staten Island, New York, voted for the first union ever at Amazon. That's a big step.
Indeed. That's a great example of younger workers and a grassroots movement where they banded together, and Amazon hammered on them pretty hard during that entire campaign. But they educated themselves in advance, stuck together, and they were able to pull off a big win there.
And Starbucks as well. We've seen some success with Starbucks and even more success than an Amazon. Most of the voting to unionize Starbucks have been successful. And there's 20,000 stores. So this is a big opportunity.
Yeah, they're filing petitions at Starbucks faster than Starbucks can even keep up with their anti-union campaigns at these locations. It's interesting to watch. I watched the feed on the National Labor Relations Board. Almost daily, you're seeing petitions filed for Starbucks.
Yeah, it's way different though than organizing for, say, an Amazon. There's maybe 20, 25 employees at a Starbucks, and it generally tends to get more liberal, open-minded workers. And then you have Amazon, you have maybe 2, 3, 4, 6,000 people. And that is a challenge. It's a different way of organizing because you have to get a lot more people involved.
Indeed, the smaller units tend to be much easier to organize.
Yeah, and then here's something interesting too in terms of organizing Amazon. They have 150% turnover rate, which I don't even know how you do that. So you have to get 30% of workers, but they're shedding workers as soon as you sign them up.
I personally have organized in the warehousing industries before, and that is probably one of the biggest challenges is the turnover in the workforce is so fast, it's hard to keep track of who's even working there. But that's also likely the biggest reason that people in those environments want a union in there in the first place.
The gig economy, that's a challenge as well. A lot of people aren't working in traditional jobs. How do you go about organizing for gig economy jobs?
Gig economy jobs create a challenge under the current labor board rules because in most circumstances, those workers are what are considered as private contractors, right? They're not actually technically employees of Uber or Lyft. They're private contractors. So it makes a challenge to hire them. There has been success in organizing Uber drivers, like out in New York City, but they are not organized as a typical labor union. They're more of a guild.
So how does this actually work? You want to organize, say, at an Amazon or any company, a Walmart. How do you first approach workers. Take us through the process.
And so many times workers will contact a labor union looking for help because of what's going on in their workplace. And most of the time, the first step is to sit down and meet with the people who initially contacted you and listen to what they're going through and find out what's going on in the workplace and take a bit of time to really educate them on what their rights are under the National Labor Relations Act and let them know that they have the right guaranteed under federal labor law to organize in their workplace. That is actually one of my favorite steps in organizing a new group because a lot of times that's the first time you've seen hope from these people. Like they're just miserable and kind of beaten down at work. And once they have their rights explained to them and they understand that they have protected right to do this, a lot of time there's like a huge weight lifted off their shoulders. Usually after that, under the current law, under the National Labor Relations Act, a union would have to secure a minimum of 30% of the workforce in order to file a petition with the National Labor Relations Board. So it's about just building a grassroots movement inside a facility, especially if you're talking about something big like Amazon.
People don't associate it unless they think about it, but we've seen a lot of downward mobility and a lot of the anger in politics right now. People's livelihoods, they can't keep up with the prices. Their lives have become more difficult. And I think that correlates to less unions. People aren't getting represented. Their wages are falling. They're not putting two and two together. But that is what has happened. The less we have had labor unions, the more people have had downward mobility.
And it's not something that's taught in school. So a lot of times, the first time people are experiencing this, they've been in the workforce for a while. They have not received any education on labor history as they grew up or went through school, unless they grew up in a union household, of course, right? And it sometimes takes a while. And let's face it, this stuff does not make headlines very often. It gets drowned out by everything else that's going on in the country. Right?
Well, it's interesting when you say that because we have business sections, but we no longer have labor sections. At one point in newspapers, there were also labor sections. So there is an absence of news when it comes to what's going on with labor.
You have to do some digging to find out what's going on with labor. It's not on headlines anywhere. It's not on the evening news. I'm surprised that the Amazon warehouse and the Starbucks are getting as much press as they are. But I guess it's kind of a big deal, I guess, right? But as far as workers' rights and things like that, people just don't know until they reach out most of the time.
The Biden administration, how do you grade them so far?
There has been a substantial change between the previous administration and the Biden administration. And I think regardless of what people's personal beliefs are, the facts really illustrate that the Trump administration's actions weakened unions and took rights away from the workers, right? And almost immediately during the Biden administration, we saw steps towards increasing worker power. And in fact, during his campaign, he had actually made comments about being the most labor-friendly president that you're ever going to see. I don't remember what the exact quote was, but that was like in September of 2020 when he was making those comments.
And has he lived up to the billing?
It's been impressive so far. We're starting to see our people in key positions in the government, right? And I think that's what's important to focus on with workers, because let's face it, the country's pretty split on which political party they're going to support, right? Mm-hmm. Which makes having these conversations about how the different political parties may support unions and working people. So a lot of times it's easier just to focus on leaving the president out of the picture. Let's focus on who they're putting around them once they get in office. Mm-hmm. And if you look at the people that the Trump administration had put in, as Secretary of Labor or as the head of the NLRB, and you look at the people that the Biden administration had put in, there is just a stark difference. Like these are our people now. Marty Walsh, who's the Secretary of Labor right now, was a union member, right? He comes out of labor. He's one of our people. Day one, within the first couple of hours of being sworn in, the first thing that Biden did was terminate Peter Robb, who was the previous general counsel for the National Labor Relations Board, vehemently anti-union.
Right. So what would you like the Biden administration to do if you could, one or two items that you would be very excited about?
I think unequivocally we need to see an overhaul of the National Labor Relations Act. Passing the PRO Act, the Protecting the Right to Organize Act, would probably be the biggest thing that could happen during this administration. Highly unlikely with the filibuster going on in the Senate that we would ever see that. But if we can...
Oh, that filibuster, what a nightmare. Oh my, it's holding up the entire country. You got Manchin and Kristen Sinema, and just holding the entire country at bay. For what, I don't know. I can kind of understand Manchin because it's West Virginia. I've been there. But Kristen Sinema just seems to be an ego trip to me.
Yeah, and maybe to fix some of these other issues that the country's going through, they just need to repeal the filibuster. I don't know if it's, I don't know if it's the right thing to do, but if we're ever going to see any major reform in regards to gun legislation or labor legislation or anything else like that, we are, the working class is held over a barrel right now with the filibuster. If that's repealed, I see the PRO Act actually passing. If the filibuster is not repealed, then.
Talk about the challenge of you have some members of the union who are clearly having their lives improved by being part of the union, and yet they're voting against their own interests by voting for MAGA, Trump type of Republicans. How do you get through to people like that? How do you say, wake up? You're actually hurting your own family to support this guy and his movement.
It's tough. Again, like I think 50% of the workers fall one way or the other, right?
Yeah.
So I think when you're talking to anybody who's at one of the political extremes, they like to focus on the wedge issues, right? The things that are always in the headlines. And I think getting them focused back to, listen, this isn't a left versus right issue. We're in the working class. This is a working class versus billionaires issue and a working class versus corporations issue. And kind of pull away from those wedge issues and actually start about talking about the things that are affecting them every single day, which is their right to organize, which is low wages, which is the decline of defined benefit pension plans and things like that. And if you can get them focused on that, I think that gives us a path to start moving forward, right?
Yeah, right. And unions have also been very supportive. It's Pride Month. Right now, there's a lot of support for diversity, including the LGBT community in many of the unions.
I think that highlighting the good things that unions and other workers' organizations do for the middle class is important to show these people that they are voting against their own self-interest.
And it amazes me that they continue to do that over and over again. I mean, you have people who are terrified in the middle of rural America that have never met a drag queen, and yet they're basing their vote upon drag queens and cutting their own wages and health benefits. It makes no sense whatsoever. I mean, it's almost cult-like, in my opinion. But speaking of elections, though, there's a big difference between the parties right now. One supports labor, one doesn't. We're in an election year. It's a very important one. Democracy, in fact, may hinge on it, but also labor rights. Talk about what you're doing right now in the unions to win elections and get the right people to support workers.
We are spending a lot of time trying to educate the membership on the differences between what the political right has done to labor unions and what the Biden administration and the Democrats have done to try and help labor unions, right?
Yes.
Spending a lot of time, getting on the ground and talking to the membership about those differences is going to be key. So our union has what we call a nonpartisan political league. It's the MNPL, Machinist Nonpartisan Political League, that is completely separate from the union. And a lot of their efforts go towards, educating members on those differences.
Is there a lot of money going into this election as well for advertising, or is it just mostly on the ground? What's the strategy?
Through our nonpartisan political league, a lot of those monies go to direct boots on the ground efforts.
What are the trends going forward? Do you see rapid rise of union membership? I mean, I spoke at the beginning of the show about how there's a lot more interest. What do you see a year or two or three from now if you're going to look into the crystal ball and the future of organizing?
Yeah, I think that you're going to see a continued increase in workers organizing, particularly if we can hold on to some of these gains that we've had with the National Labor Relations Board, right? Mm-hmm. With crushing inflation and things like that and unemployment being low, employers are almost certainly not going to be able to, or not going to be willing to keep wage increases and benefit increases at pace with inflation, which will almost certainly frustrate workers and drive them towards labor unions, right? Right now, it's becoming easier and easier for workers to organize because of steps that have been taken by the National Labor Relations Board since the Biden administration took over. Literally since day one, the new GC, General Counsel for the National Labor Relations Board, has been making efforts almost daily to make it easier for workers to organize. Just, I think it was September, White House Task Force on Worker Organizing and Empowerment released a report. That was something that was headed up and chaired by Vice President Kamala Harris. And the Biden administration, through the rest of the duration of their tenure in the White House, can continue at this pace, will almost certainly make it easier and more likely for workers to come to labor.
Yeah, one of the problems I have when I talk to people about the issue is they are delusional. They're working at a job that doesn't pay very much. It's hard work. And yet they think if they just cozy up to the billionaire, the bosses, that it's going to rub off and they're magically going to be riding in that private jet or that yacht. I think that's some of the appeal to Donald Trump and why, for example, his grift. They're willing to throw him money because they vicariously want that lifestyle. And they believe that if they just do things the right way, they will achieve that. Kind of this, almost like with religion, the prosperity gospel. It's very similar to that. And I think that is one of the things that's difficult to break through to people, that, that's not going to happen to you. It's 1 in 10 million. What's better off is if you have higher wages and healthcare and a future and retirement, and then you don't have to work until you die.
Yeah, absolutely. It's astounding to me that you will see people in some of the poorest areas of the country who are suffering from some of the worst issues that our economy is suffering, stand up and defend millionaires and billionaires tooth and nail. They think that they'll someday get there, but you can't find one example of trickle-down economics ever actually helping anybody. But you can find thousands of examples where labor unions have actually improved the working conditions and the wages and the benefits for workers. It's all over the place. There's evidence for that everywhere, right? You can look at statistics all day long and see how labor unions increase wages and benefits for workers. You can't find any information anywhere on how trickle-down economics has ever helped anybody.
One of the tricks they use psychologically is they make people feel lazy. They'll say, well, if you work hard enough, you'll get here. You'll work hard. You're just not working hard. And people go, yes, I am. I want to work hard. And people fall for it. Like, I don't want to be called lazy. I'll pull myself up by my bootstraps. And it's that psychological, they use because they're wealthy. And they say, I got here by working hard. You're not me because you're not working. And they're very successful at that. And people will say, I don't need any help. I don't need any assistance from government or a union. I'll do it myself. I'm self-sufficient. That's one of the biggest psychological tricks they use, and it's very, very successful.
As offensive as the concept is of walking up to somebody who's struggling financially and saying, oh, you should just be trying harder. And this coming from a billionaire who started this company with a couple $1 million loan, likely from his father or some other family member. And it's so offensive, it's hard to believe that at the same time, it's still effective. I don't understand why people are falling for it.
I think I know why. Mommy and daddy issues. These people grow up or you get it from their parents that you need to work hard. You need to bust your butt and you'll make something of yourself one day. People want to please the authority figure. It's that psychology, in my opinion, of what motivates people. I look back to playing football and basketball. My coaches were the same way. You need to work hard. You're not going to start. You're not going to make the all-star team unless you get to the gym every day. Work. You're not working hard enough. I'm like, coach, I've been working 12 hours a day. I think it's that kind of mentality, but it's a very authoritarian manipulation in my view.
That's probably a big part of it. I think a big part of it is people just get comfortable. As unhappy as they may be, it doesn't take a ton of effort to remain at a low level and function at a low level.
Well, it's easy to convince them that, things aren't maybe what you hoped, but they could get worse.
Yeah.
And I think people are fearful of that. So that's how they keep taking wages and benefits and saying, hey, look, be happy with what you're with. Don't be one of these people who complains all the time. You want to be a whiner. That's the other one they use. You want to be a whiner if you complain about that. And people are afraid to lose the little they have. And so they all fight over a smaller and smaller piece of the pie.
I've routinely also seen people who I guess aren't that downtrodden, right?
Mm-hmm.
That still would rather just blame their woes on other people. And it's that kind of like lazy thought process. They'll blame everything that's going on other people. And they say, okay, well, give me an example of why it's somebody else's fault. And they can't give you a policy reason. They can't give you an example. But again, it doesn't take much to remain functioning at a lower level. It takes courage, it takes dedication, and it takes a little bit of work to, climb out of that reality.
And some vision and seeing a better future. And I think it's hard to get people to see that. And I think that's one of the jobs you do is you make them see the bigger picture and say, there's something better out there. Your life can improve, but you need to take action and step up and do it yourself and organize. And this can occur. And you don't have to deprive yourself of these basic needs that you're not getting, or maybe you're getting them, but you can do more. You can have a better life.
Sure.
And I think it's making people see that. It's probably one of the biggest challenges.
It is. It helps to have a good background story too. I organized the shop that I came out of originally. When I talk to workers who are considering organizing, I can have that conversation with them from a standpoint of somebody who did it. Right. My wife and I first got married back in 2001. I had just gotten out of the military. She had just graduated college. It was 2001. We had bought our first house, 100% financing. This was back when they still had, these crazy mortgages that they would give young kids that could never afford. Right.
Right. Yeah.
Let's see, got married in June. I walked out on strike to organize my shop in October. I'd lived through what it took to get through that and had an amazingly successful career as a mechanic after that. I think having some examples like that to show people, being able to have that conversation with them is key to getting them over that fear hump. I had tried working hard. I had tried showing up earlier. And every year I tried harder. Every time I tried harder, it didn't help my wages go up. It didn't help my benefits go up. But I'll tell you what did help. When we got done organizing, and all of a sudden I had a contract and I had a pension and I had health insurance that was 100% paid for by my employer, my wages went up $11 on day one after we organized.
Yeah, that definitely is a good boost.
Yeah. So, employers going to you and saying, oh, just try a little harder, buddy. You're part of the family and someday you'll be at the top. Show me an example of where that actually paid off.
Oh, yeah. That's another example. They want to make you part of the family. Anytime I hear that, I want to run. Because when most employers talk about it's a family, they're the father and you're the little kid. And they're setting the rules and sending you to your room. And then if you try to make your life better, don't talk back. To me, that's a big red flag from places I've worked.
Oh, yeah. They'll almost try and make you feel bad when you go to organize for questioning the way that they're running the company. All the while, your wages aren't keeping with inflation. All the while, every year, your insurance goes up. All the while, you've got nothing saved for retirement.
Right. Because if they're the family, you're the spoiled kid who's complaining. That needs to be sent to your room. I mean, that's kind of dynamic that not always. I mean, some of these places are, it is a family atmosphere, but a lot of the time it's sort of this dynamic and they want to create that. So if you do speak out, you feel bad, like you're undermining your own family. That's kind of the dynamic. Anything else you want to add that we may have missed?
I just think that, focusing on what the presidential impact on labor can be is probably the most important thing that we can do between now and election day, and focus on these huge differences that we've seen between the two administrations. And I think when you do that, you can leave the candidates out of it. I think you can get workers focused back on voting for their own self-interest.
I certainly hope you're right, because this is exactly what the country needs. Politics get more extreme as the disparity in wealth. When you have incredible differences in the rich and the poor and the middle class is hollowed out, people are angry and looking for scapegoats. And I think it's had a bad impact on us politically. It's made people angry and looking for answers and solutions, and many times in the wrong place. And so the more we can build an equitable society where people are making a fair living and can, say, have a home and have a family and afford it, I think the less they'll be attracted to these charlatans that are making promises and blaming scapegoats.
Making sure that people become class conscious is probably the biggest obstacle. I do not think people generally can conceive the massive divide in wealth between, the everyday average working class family and the Jeff Bezoses and, these just crazy, insanely rich people, and how long it would take for a worker to earn even an hour's salary of one of these people.
All right. Thank you so much for being on the show today. I appreciate it.
Wayne, excellent. Always good to see you. Always pleased to come on the show.
Thank you for listening to War of the Words. I hope you enjoyed the show. Please tell your friends and family about us. We are available on all major podcast platforms, including Spotify, Apple, and Anchor. Have a great week. Until we meet again, see you next time.